I'd like to welcome the second speaker on the opposition side of the motion. Moly Boulding is a student studying English in her second year at Sidney Sussex College. She won this slot through open audition. Moly, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I feel I have somewhat of an impossible act to follow, so I'm going to give something vaguely resembling an after-dinner speech and see how we get on. Okay, firstly, I would like to thank the committee for organising this debate, and to thank all of you for attending. It's a privilege to be speaking here this evening. This is actually my second time as a student guest speaker, the first being just over a year ago, and it is incredibly exciting to be back in the chamber in this capacity again. I feel I should start my speech tonight with a short preface, as it were, before moving to the body of my argument. For those of you who don't know me, I am a passionate student of English, and have been for about as long as I can remember. I learned to read long before I started school, spent almost every day of primary school with my head stuck in a book in the reading corner, and have metaphorically consumed every written text I can get my hands on since. Like a sort of blonde Matilda, with the help of my books, I have travelled through time and space, visited every corner of the globe, and been to almost every period in history. In short, I love to read. Thus, it was with immense joy that I noted the motion of this debate, concerning a pair of authors who are both very close to my heart. But when it came to auditioning for it, asking myself to choose a side to speak for felt somewhat like asking a parent if they have a favourite child. Of course they do, but it's difficult not to feel somewhat chagrined in admitting it. But nonetheless, my decision was made, and I am here tonight to present an opposing argument that will hopefully bring some clarity to the vague brilliance of the two men we are here to discuss. Wherever possible, I'm going to allow Orwell's words to speak for themselves. After all, modern writing at its worst does not consist in picking out words for the sake of their meaning, and inventing images in order to make the meaning clearer. It consists simply of gumming together long strips of words which have already been set in order by somebody else, and making the results presentable by sheer humbug. When I mentioned to a friend that I would be opposing the motion tonight, his exact words were, well, Animal Farm is boring, but 1984 was great. And in that simple statement, he outlined one of the first problems that arises with famous authors: the books that they become famous for. Without a shadow of a doubt, Animal Farm and 1984 are legendary texts. They are part of school curriculums everywhere, they make their way onto every top 100 literature list, and they epitomize some of the Western world's greatest hopes and fears. Put neatly by the Encyclopedia Britannica, Orwell's warning of the potential dangers of totalitarianism made a deep impression on his contemporaries and upon subsequent readers, and many of his coined words and phrases became bywords for modern political abuses. What Shakespeare gave to Elizabethan English, Orwell arguably gave to modern political English, since he is also most likely responsible for the invention of the phrase Cold War, which was first noted in his essay You and the Atom Bomb in 1945. In the same vein that sees Machiavellian, Kafkaesque, and draconian enter vernacular English, Orwellian has become an increasingly relevant description of a world where our phones appear to listen to us, and we sign away our information to machines who constantly quiz us about whether or not we are robots so we can have it back. I can only speak for myself, but I know that I remember vividly the first time I read these books, feeling my skin crawl as I imagined the freedoms of thought and speech I so readily take for granted slowly slipping away. I was eerily reminded of this feeling on the morning I learned of Brexit, and of Trump's election, and of Cambridge Analytica, and a million other days where similar neologisms, fake news, or my favorite, post-truth, have been spewed out by the 24-hour news cycle. Wilde may have been comforting in his wit, wisdom, and Victorian living room tableau comedy, but there is an exponentially greater reassurance in reckoning with the worst-case scenario, one that is haunted not by aging paintings and bluff alter egos, but by government officials, closed doors, and an insistence on rewriting the present. The point that I'm trying to make is that Orwell himself is the one that Orwell himself observed, that the best books, or at least those of his that are best known, are those that tell you what you know already. In the same way that there is this misguided belief that the media informs public interest, when actually it is public interest that informs the media, Orwell himself acknowledges that he is simply crystallizing and coalescing a set of ideas that have haunted our social conscience for centuries. Both Animal Farm and 1984 achieved widespread acclaim. They are both novels that explore Orwell's deep and fearful fascinations with the comprehensive rigor of the extremes of the political system. But They were the last books Orwell wrote, in a life where he completed 7 other novels, dozens of poems, and hundreds of pamphlets and articles. It would be wrong to allow these 2 mighty texts, albeit the ones that propelled him to relative fame, to obscure an entire life's work of equally insightful, useful, and entertaining literature. And with that, I want to offer you another side to Orwell. Orwell the poet, the critic, the essayist, the journalist, and the reviewer. As already mentioned tonight, George Orwell is actually Eric Arthur Blair, born in Motihari in India in 1903, into a family of what he referred to as the landless gentry, meaning lower middle class with immense aspirations. He attended prep school in Sussex, which landed him a scholarship at Eton, and later he returned to Burma as a member of the Imperial Police. Yet his misery upon realizing that the conditions the British had forced on the Burmese became overwhelming, and while he could leave Burma and the Imperial Police behind, he kept with him a feeling of guilt about his role as a colonial officer. Given the social distinctions which had meant he couldn't intermingle with the Burmese, he decided instead to spend time among the homeless of London and in the slums of Paris, where his dream of becoming a writer was born into his first book, Down and Out in Paris and London. Like all of Orwell's work, it is semi-autobiographical, having been intended as non-fiction and having somewhere along the way morphed into something in between. He later worked as a teacher and as a shop assistant in the north of England, where he wrote The Road to Wigan Pier, as we've heard, and his time fighting in the Spanish Civil War bore us homage to Catalonia. The rest of his bibliography is equally informed by his experiences, and much of both his personal and journalistic correspondence gives us an insight into the life of a man who was increasingly exposed to injustice, struggle, and the harsh realities of political introversion. Yet among this are gems, like Books versus Cigarettes, one of my favorite essays in which he weighs the cost of the value of literature in modern life, or Nonsense Poetry, another essay in which he captures the spirit of Edward Lear and Lewis Carroll, or perhaps alternatively his verse, with cutting witticism to rival Wilde. A happy vicar I might have been, he writes, 200 years ago, to preach upon eternal doom and watch my walnuts grow. But born, alas, in an evil time, I missed that pleasant haven, for the hair has grown on my upper lip, and the clergy are all clean-shaven. The same man that saw into our political soul, codified good... Yeah?
Orwell was so good at predicting...
Yeah.
If Orwell was so good at predicting the future in his writing, would it have killed him to write something optimistic?
I think an answer to that question only has to reflect possibly on the present circumstances to think that we could all do with a bit more optimism throughout history. But the point I'm trying to make is not that he was not, that he's entirely pessimistic. On the contrary, he did write many works that were optimistic, but the point isn't to write things that inspire sort of pleasure or happiness. He was never trying to simply sort of offer blind sort of delight. He was offering a realism that is perhaps uncomfortable at times and often deliberately so. But at the same time, my point is that he offered a comic and often potentially very entertaining side. He is not a two-dimensional figure who only wrote political nightmares. The same man that saw into our political soul, who codified what good essay writing looks like, who anthropomorphized the Russian Revolution, invented Room 101, and taught us that the ultimate freedom is that 2 + 2 can equal 4, is the same man who wrote amusing rhymes and comic verse. To distill his work down to simply heralding the political misfortune of today is an insult to his wide-ranging skill, technique, and accessible, insightful style. Ultimately, literature is not an either-or. There is space on every bookshelf for both of these authors, and a responsibility for us to carry forward the important themes and ideas that they raise. However, the decision falls to you tonight as to whether I've done a good enough job of persuading you that there is a time and a place for Orwell, and that time and place is now. In his own words, there are occasions when it pays better to fight and be beaten than not to fight at all. Thank you.